everybody, it has been an incredibly long time since I've posted on this channel, like 9 months. I never planned to take a break. Life just happened, and the entire time I've been planning what I would say when I got back to this channel and just like explaining what's been going on in the meantime. But now there's the virus, and I just felt like I wanted to talk about the situation that it has put me in. And I would say it's kind of a unique situation. But it's a bit difficult to explain why I'm in this situation without getting into more detail about what's been going on. And I'm gonna try to make that as brief as possible. Basically, my home has been in Germany for most of the past decade, even though I spent a few of those years in France. But since I was having trouble having any luck with my plans in either of those countries, I went on to the next plan, which was in Hungary. Hungary didn't work out as well as I had hoped either, but I did apply for residency in Hungary last year, and then I was supposed to be in Germany just briefly to go to doctor's appointments and stock up on meds and stuff like that. And I ended up being there a lot longer than I had intended, partially because I was just so exhausted from the time that I had spent in Hungary that I didn't have the energy to travel. And there were also a lot of issues with the place where I normally stay in Germany. I was assaulted there a year before, and then when I came back from Hungary, I realized like half of my stuff was missing, and I wanted to search through like the entire house to see if I could find anything again, which just took so much energy. It took so much time to even work up to having the energy to do that. But it was really I didn't feel safe there anymore because I have some degree of PTSD from being assaulted, and then also issues with not just the people who assaulted me, but also the people who stole my stuff. So Germany was no longer really an ideal situation because I only had this one place to stay, which was no longer what it used to be, and I decided to go spend some time in Italy with a friend. So I left Germany to go to Italy. At that point, the virus was in a couple places in Germany. I knew that it was in Bayern, but not directly in Munich, and I actually took the train this time. Normally I would take a cheap flight, but then that would involve traveling several hours to another city, dealing with their public transport to get to the airport, and then flying, and then going from the airport again, traveling several hours to my final destination. So I decided it would be a lot less strenuous to take the train, or at least I wanted to give it a try and find out if that was the case. The train passed through Munich. At the time there were a couple cases in Bayern, but not in Munich. I was aware of it, but I didn't feel like I was crossing directly through a danger zone. Then I think about a week after I arrived in Italy, the virus appeared in Italy. But it was, as everyone knows, in northern Italy, and I was a little bit farther south than that. I was in Tuscany, and things sort of evolved. We were aware that northern Italy was under quarantine. I was barely going out at all, so I wasn't really experiencing things firsthand, but my friend would say like he would go to the store and like this hand sanitizer would be gone. At the time I had a friend in Hong Kong who was really desperately searching for masks, and I was like, oh, well, we should go see if we can find some masks and send them to her. And this was before the virus had reached Italy, and I thought, well, of course we shouldn't have any trouble finding masks here. And my friend went out and checked several pharmacies and he couldn't find any. And then shortly after that was when the virus appeared. And it was still like, okay, well, it's not in this region. My friend owns a restaurant, and he said business was a lot slower. He was making like a quarter what he normally makes. But overall, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't like people were in panic. It wasn't like super different. You know, it was like life more or less remained the same. And then when I left Italy, a few weeks after the virus had reached us, it was, I think, around 300 cases in the country. The nearest case was about like 45 minutes away in the nearest city. So again, we felt like, okay, it's close. It's a city that we had been to, you know, shortly before the cases appeared there. But, you know, it still wasn't right where we were. So, you know, maybe a couple people were like, you know, close the borders. But at that time, it felt like a very extreme response. I was still a little bit apprehensive. I thought that my flight might get canceled, and I was kind of hoping it would get canceled just because I had zero energy, and I didn't want to have to deal with traveling and, you know, all of the exhaustion that would come with that. But since my flight wasn't canceled, and at the time there were no cases in Hungary, I felt like I couldn't use the virus as an excuse, because, you know, they're going to say that there is no virus in Hungary at the time. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna go ahead. If the flight isn't canceled, I'm gonna go. And the day that I arrived in Hungary, just over 2 weeks ago, was the day that the virus first appeared. It was like a few hours later, they announced that they had 2 cases in Hungary. And I needed to come back to Hungary because I had applied for a residence permit last year, and I needed to see what was going on with that. So I had an incredibly long day traveling through Italy to get to the airport. I passed through Firenze, which is the nearby city that had, you know, at least 1 case. I only saw like 1 person in the train there who was wearing a mask. I got to the airport in Bologna, and there were definitely more people wearing masks in the airport, but it still wasn't like super panicky. And I mean, people were still allowed to travel like normal. The only thing I noticed was when we landed in Hungary, they made an announcement saying, if you think you might have the virus, come and present yourself to us so we can like inspect you, I guess. And if they suspect that you might have symptoms, they have the right to pull you aside. But it's not like we had to go through any sort of check or anything. We basically just walked right out of the airport. And I was really anxious about this whole residency thing. I didn't want to put it off any longer. So I went straight to the immigration office that day. That ended up being incredibly long and exhausting, and that will be another video. But basically I pushed myself so much that day that I ended up crashed for the entire next week. So I was barely getting out of bed, not going anywhere, not even leaving the hostel. But I had booked a return flight, and it was supposed to be for 2 weeks after I arrived, so it would have been 2 days ago. But the flight ended up getting canceled a week before because of what was going on with the virus. When I left Italy, it was about like 300 cases, and things just really exploded after I left. And, you know, it got so much worse to the point where the whole country was in quarantine. All flights to Italy were stopped. I'm still very much aware of the situation in Italy because I'm talking to the friend I stayed with and a lot of other people who were, you know, under very strict quarantine. Like it sort of slowly increased. Like at first, restaurants were supposed to close before 6, and then you know, everything non-essential was closed, and then it was like, you know, kind of stay home, and then it got to the point where like they were issuing this piece of paper saying like you're only allowed to go to home, work, you know, for an emergency, like to the hospital, pharmacy or something, or to get food. And then you're supposed to enter in the address of your home or work at the bottom of this paper so that if you get stopped, you can prove where you're going. They'll have like the police doing checks and asking where people are going, or stopping people who are, you know, in groups of, you know, even like 10 people or something. So, you know, I'm very much aware of like how that's like, how things have slowly intensified in Italy. But being in Hungary, it's a very different atmosphere. It was like up to 30 cases this weekend. And then like Monday, you know, I think, you know, basically like overnight it was up to 50. Now it's up to 58. So it is slowly increasing, but in Hungary they're taking it a lot more seriously because they're seeing what's happening in the rest of the world, and so many other countries are closing their borders. So I could tell that things were really intense, and I knew my flight was canceled. And I spent the next few days really stressed about what I was going to do, because I didn't know if I should stay in Hungary, where for now I feel safer because there's still dramatically less here, you know, less cases here right now. But then on the other hand, I'm thinking it's going to get a lot worse, and the healthcare system is also a lot worse here. So do I want to be stuck in Hungary when it gets worse? So basically I had planned to go back to Italy, but since that was no longer an option, I was considering going to Germany or France, which at the time both had about 2,000 cases. And, you know, clearly things were a lot worse. The place where I normally stay in Germany, like, clearly already had a lot of issues. And then on top of that, one of the kids at that place had been in school playing with another kid, and that kid's father had been confirmed to have the virus. So there's a chance that, you know, like, there's a pretty good chance that his son had it and passed it on to this other kid where I stay. So not only would I be walking into a city where there's already confirmed cases, like, it will potentially be in the home where I'm staying very soon. So, you know, that felt very risky on a lot of different levels. Alternatively, I could have gone to France, but like I said, France already had, you know, just as many cases as Germany. And from what I've seen, it's spread a lot faster in small towns than in big cities, which I don't really understand. But it didn't exactly feel like I would be safer there. You know, that would also be, this is like another ME patient who said that I could stay with her. You know, but it was someone I've never met before, and I didn't really know what the situation was going to be like, and I didn't want to be stuck there potentially for months if I didn't feel comfortable there. So in the end, I decided to stay in Hungary, and that was the thing that stressed me out the most. Honestly, I was incredibly anxious for several days where I was like not getting enough sleep, and you know, at one point I was really hungry, and I didn't eat anything for like another 12 hours. But, you know, basically once that window closed, I felt a lot calmer because, you know, I was more content to stay in Hungary anyway, since I'm trying to learn Hungarian. Now I'm seeing things are like slowly escalating here. It's still more in the beginning stages. At the time, like over the weekend, you know, you could see like these announcements being made in Germany and France, where like they were slowly closing the borders and saying like you can only enter if you're a citizen, resident, or working. So you know, they weren't accepting tourists anymore. But in Hungary, it was still the first thing you notice was like the streets were a lot quieter. There are a lot less tourists out walking. The hostel I'm staying in was saying that they have a lot less guests than they normally would, even on the weekends, and taking into consideration that it's the off season. And then you started seeing, like, over the past few days, these like new rules being implemented where they're saying, you know, like all like the baths and public museums and libraries and stuff like that were closed. Any sort of like large events were canceled. And then just like over the last couple of days, they stopped letting foreigners into the country, which of course is going to bring the tourism industry to a halt unless they were already here. But I mean, there's really nothing they can go out and do at this point anyways. And now we're at the point where businesses are closing at 3 if they're considered non-essential stuff, like not related to food or pharmacies. There's some where you can see like they're closed a bit where they normally wouldn't be, like even in the great market hall. There's a large you know, a large portion of the vendors are not open. I've seen like a handful of people wearing masks, but it's still definitely not like this panicky feeling. It's not like everyone's been told to stay inside and at home. There's still people, you know, obviously you can hear like the cars on the street. There's people out walking. I just saw that in the pharmacy they had one person inside, and there's like someone guarding the door and saying like wait until those people leave before the next person is allowed to come in. But I would still say it's not like, you know, mass panic compared to what I'm hearing from other countries where I'm keeping up with the news. Like, it's still pretty chill here, you know, which is nice for the moment. What I have heard is that I overheard the guy from the hostel saying that they might be closing next month, which could be an issue. Now I'm kind of apprehensive about that. For now, you know, I'm not even super worried about myself, even though I'm at higher risk than average probably. And to be honest, I feel like since I'm staying in a hostel anyway, and the other people in the hostel are going out, you know, I might as well go out and walk around and enjoy the weather myself. So yeah, that's where I am right now. I think it's sort of a unique situation because I'm sure there's a lot of travelers who are stuck in this situation. Not so much people with health problems. So yeah, hopefully I'll be fine. We'll see how things develop. The way things are going, it's looking like it's probably gonna be at least another month, possibly 2, maybe even longer before things cool down in Italy. Right now, I probably wouldn't be able to go to France or Germany if I tried. So if the hostel closes, maybe I'll have to find another hostel in the city. Maybe I can go to another place in Hungary. Technically, I could still go to Italy because they haven't actually closed the borders. They just canceled flights. But obviously that isn't ideal at the moment either. So we'll see.